How does a 20-year-old boy end up ruling the known world? How does someone barely old enough to grow a proper beard command hardened veterans and inspire them to march to the ends of the earth? It remains one of history's most fascinating tales. The boy's name was Alexander, and for all the myths and legends that would surround him, he would prove himself worthy of the title Great. Born in 356 BC, Alexander was raised in the shadow of power. His father, Philip II of Macedon, was building an empire, but it was his mother Olympias who shaped his destiny. Legend has it that on the night before his parents' wedding, Olympias dreamed a thunderbolt fell upon her womb, igniting a fire that spread far and wide. Like many great origin stories, it spoke to something true. Alexander would indeed spread like wildfire across the known world. The omens of greatness followed him from birth. It was said that on the day he was born, the great temple of Artemis at Ephesus burned to the ground, for the goddess was away attending his birth. His mother Olympias, a fierce and ambitious woman, told him repeatedly that his true father was Zeus himself, planting in him the seeds of divine destiny. By the time he was 7, Alexander had already shown signs of the extraordinary. He tamed the mighty horse Bucephalus, a feat that made his father weep with pride, declaring, "My son, seek out a kingdom worthy of yourself, for Macedonia is too small for you." The horse was considered untamable, but young Alexander noticed it was afraid of its own shadow. He turned the horse toward the sun, and suddenly the shadow disappeared. It would be the first of many times Alexander would solve a problem by seeing what others couldn't. His education shaped him profoundly. Aristotle himself, who would become Alexander's teacher, saw something remarkable in the young prince. Their lessons took place in the sacred grove of the nymphs, where Alexander's mind was filled with Homer's tales of heroes and glory. But Aristotle taught him more than just poetry. He instilled in him a curiosity about the natural world that would later lead Alexander to send back specimens of plants and animals from his conquests for scientific study. Under the philosopher's guidance, Alexander developed an insatiable intellectual curiosity. He memorized the Iliad, keeping a copy under his pillow alongside his dagger, and dreamed of matching the feats of Achilles. His companions called him Achilles, and he spent his life trying to live up to that name. The young prince's first taste of command came at the Battle of Chaeronea in 338 BC, where he led the cavalry charge that broke the famous Theban sacred band, an elite unit of 300 warriors who had never been defeated. At 16, he had already proven himself a brilliant tactical commander, leading the decisive charge that won the day. But fate had greater challenges in store. In 336 BC, his father was assassinated at his daughter's wedding feast. Alexander, not yet 20, found himself king of a powerful but unstable kingdom, surrounded by enemies who thought him too young to rule. They would learn their mistake quickly. When Thebes rebelled, testing the new king's resolve, Alexander responded with such swift and terrible force that no Greek city dared challenge him again. The Persian Empire he faced was the superpower of its day, stretching from Egypt to India. Its army was said to be so vast that their arrows would blot out the sun. Yet Alexander didn't flinch. When asked how he could hope to defeat such an empire with his small Macedonian army, he reportedly said, "An army of sheep led by a lion is better than an army of lions led by a sheep." What followed was a campaign of conquest that reads like fantasy. He never lost a battle. At Issus, he defeated a Persian army nearly 5 times his size. At Tyre, he built a causeway across the sea to capture an island fortress that had never fallen. At Gaugamela, he faced war elephants and scythe chariots on an open plain and won. His strategy was always the same: find the enemy's strongest point and break it. When he reached the legendary Knot of Gordium, which prophecy said could only be undone by the future ruler of Asia, he simply cut it with his sword. Alexander cuts became a phrase for solving problems with bold, decisive action. The oracle at Siwa in Egypt declared him the son of Zeus. The Persian capital of Persepolis fell to him, and he took the title of Great King. But victory came with a price. His best friend Hephaestion died in his arms. His beloved horse Bucephalus fell in battle. The weight of empire and the constant plotting of those around him wore on his soul. There were assassination attempts, mutinies, and the crushing loneliness that comes with being the most powerful person in the world. In the deserts and mountains of his campaign, he shared every hardship with his men. When they marched without water, he poured out a helmet offered to him, saying he wouldn't drink if his men couldn't. When they marched through snow, he gave up his own horse to walk alongside the wounded. His men would follow him anywhere, because he never asked them to endure what he wouldn't endure himself. His vision went beyond conquest. In every land he conquered, Alexander built cities, 70 of them, all named Alexandria. But these weren't just military outposts. They were centers of trade, learning, and cultural exchange. He encourages soldiers to marry local women and adopt local customs. He himself married Roxana, a Bactrian princess, in what appeared to be a genuine attempt to unite East and West. This wasn't just political expediency. Alexander had a genuine curiosity about other cultures that was rare for his time. He studied Persian customs, adopted some of their dress, and showed respect for local religions. When he reached India, he spent hours talking with yogis and philosophers. One of them, Dandames, reportedly told him that all his conquests were meaningless since he couldn't conquer death. Perhaps that's why he pushed so hard, drove himself and his men to the very edges of the known world. At the Hyphasis River in India, his army finally refused to go further. Alexander spent 3 days in his tent, refusing to speak to anyone. When he emerged, he wept not from anger, but because there were no more worlds to conquer. His reign lasted just 13 years. In 323 BC, at age 32, Alexander fell ill in Babylon. His last words, according to some sources, were "to the strongest," leaving his empire to fate and ensuring centuries of war among his successors. The fever that killed him, whether from typhoid, malaria, or poison, took 12 days to end his life. During that time, his soldiers filed past his bed, saying goodbye to the man who had led them across the known world. These hardened veterans wept openly. They knew they would never see his like again. His empire stretched from Greece to India, encompassing most of the known world. He had founded cities that would last millennia, created trade routes that would enrich civilizations for centuries to come, and spread Greek culture across Asia. The Hellenistic age he inaugurated would transform the ancient world. The library he founded in Alexandria became the greatest center of learning in the ancient world. Its scholars invented geometry, calculated the circumference of the earth, and created the foundations of modern science. In Afghanistan, they still tell stories of Iskander, Alexander, and in India, his legend lives on in art and literature. His death marked the end of an era. The empire he built would fragment, but the cultural fusion he created would endure. Greek art, philosophy, and science spread across Asia. Eastern mysticism and religion flowed back to Europe. The world grew larger and smaller at the same time. The great irony is that Alexander, who sought immortality so desperately, achieved it not through his conquests, but through his vision. When asked why he started his campaign so young, he replied, "My father will go on conquering until there's nothing left for me to do." It wasn't just territory he was after, it was greatness itself. The young king who dreamed of reaching the end of the world never found it, but in failing to find those limits, he proved that maybe they don't exist at all. As he told his men at Gaugamela, there is nothing impossible to him who will try. His life was a testament to that belief that with enough courage, determination, and vision, one person could change the world. Remember, Alexander's greatness lay not just in his victories, but in his ability to imagine a world larger than anyone had dreamed possible, and then make that dream reality. He didn't just conquer the world, he transformed it, creating connections between cultures that would last for millennia. In the end, that may be his greatest legacy, not the empire that crumbled, but the world he helped create, where ideas and cultures could flow freely across the boundaries of geography and tradition.